The countdown began with a metallic click that echoed off the canyon walls like a death knell. Jesse's fingers dug into the splintered barnwood as the lead executioner, a man whose black bandana couldn't hide the cruel set of his eyes, chambered around. The sound made Moonfeather's ears twitch, but the stallion remained still, his silver-white coat gleaming like liquid mercury in the harsh afternoon light. "Should have minded your own business, boy," came Silas Crane's gravelly voice from somewhere below. Jesse couldn't see the cattle baron from his hiding spot in the hayloft, but he'd recognize that voice anywhere. It had haunted his nightmares since the day his father was stripped of his foreman position and cast out like a rabid dog. "That horse of yours got too curious for his own good." Jesse bit down on his knuckle to keep from crying out. 3 days ago, Moonfeather had been grazing near the old cottonwood grove when he'd started pawing at the earth, snorting and prancing like he'd caught an unusual scent. Jesse had found strange markings in the dirt, symbols that looked familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd seen them before. Then Crane's men had arrived, claiming Moonfeather had trampled the prize Angus bull, though Jesse knew for certain the bull had been found dead 2 miles away near Widow's Canyon. The setup was obvious to anyone with half a brain, but in Perdition Creek, Crane's word was law. "Papa should have kept you both on a tighter leash," Crane continued, his boots crunching across the packed earth. Just like he should have kept his mouth shut about what he saw that night. Jesse's breath caught. What night? What had his father seen? Through a gap in the barn boards, he watched one of the masked men adjust his grip on a Winchester rifle. The man's hands trembled slightly. Whether from nerves or the brutal heat, Jesse couldn't tell. None of Crane's usual ranch hands were among the executioners. These were hired guns, brought in special for the occasion. Men who wouldn't ask questions about killing a magnificent horse over a fabricated offense. Moonfeather turned his great head toward the barn, and for a moment, Jesse could swear the stallion was looking directly at him. Those dark eyes held an intelligence that had always unsettled the other ranchers. Too knowing, they'd whisper, too human. His grandfather had said that some horses were born with old souls, spirits that had walked between worlds before taking flesh again. The wind picked up, sending dust devils spiraling across the courtyard. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark omens, though rain rarely visited Perdition Creek in August. The air itself felt charged, electric, as if the very sky was holding its breath. "You know what your grandfather told me before he disappeared?" Crane's voice carried a note of bitter amusement. "Said this land would have its reckoning, said the dead wouldn't stay quiet forever." A harsh laugh. Crazy old Indian nonsense. But Jesse remembered his grandfather differently. Ayanna had been respected even by the white settlers, a man who could heal sick cattle and find water where others saw only barren earth. He'd taught Jesse to read the ancient symbols carved into canyon walls, to listen for voices in the wind, to understand that some places held memory like water holds minerals, invisible but undeniably present. The Cottonwood Grove was one of those places. Jesse closed his eyes and tried to recall his grandfather's stories about the sacred grounds. Something about a spring that bubbled up from deep earth, water that could grant power over life and death to those pure enough to drink from it. But the stories always ended the same way, with warnings about disturbing what was meant to remain hidden. "Ready." The executioner's command snapped Jesse back to the present horror. 5 rifles rose in unison, their barrels glinting like steel fangs in the sunlight. Moonfeather stood perfectly still, as if he understood what was coming and had accepted it with a dignity that shamed the men about to kill him. Jesse couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His whole world was about to be destroyed by a lie, and there was nothing a 10-year-old boy could do to stop it. His father was 20 miles away in Tucson, looking for work that would never come, not after Crane had blacklisted the Hawthorne name throughout the territory. Thunder rumbled overhead, though the storm clouds seemed impossibly distant. The sound reverberated through the canyon like a heartbeat, deep and primal and angry. Moonfeather whinnied once, a sound like music, like farewell, like forgiveness. "Aim." Jesse scrambled down from the loft, no longer caring if they saw him. He burst through the barn doors into the blazing courtyard, tears streaming down his dust-caked cheeks, knowing he was too late but unable to stop himself from trying to reach his horse, his friend, his brother in all the ways that mattered. The rifles tracked toward Moonfeather's heart as Jesse ran. The ordinary world. No! Jesse's voice cracked as he sprinted across the sun-baked earth, his bare feet slapping against stones that bit like heated coals. Please don't! A rifle butt caught him in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the dust. Stars exploded behind his eyes as rough hands hauled him upright, fingers digging into his shoulders hard enough to bruise. Well, well, Crane's voice oozed false sympathy. Look what we got here, boys. The little prince himself. Jesse blinked away tears and dust, focusing on the man who'd destroyed his family. Silas Crane stood like a monument to cruelty, 6 feet of sun-weathered leather and iron will, his silver mustache perfectly groomed despite the heat. Everything about him spoke of power. The hand-tooled boots that probably cost more than most families saw in a year, the ivory-handled Colt at his hip, the way even his own men stepped aside when he moved. "Let me go!" Jesse twisted against the grip holding him, but the hired gun's hands were like manacles. Moonfeather didn't do nothing wrong, and you know it. Crane's pale blue eyes glittered with amusement. Boy's got spirit, I'll give him that. Reminds me of his daddy at that age, all fire and righteousness. Convinced the world owed him something fair. The words stung because Jesse knew what had happened to that fire in his father. 3 months of unemployment had worn Tom Hawthorne down to a shadow of the man who'd once commanded respect from every cowhand in the territory. These days, Papa spent his mornings staring at the horizon and his evenings nursing cheap whiskey, muttering about things that didn't make sense, about seeing lights where there shouldn't be any, about the earth itself crying out in pain. Your pa's probably halfway to California by now, Crane continued, circling Jesse like a vulture. Smart man knows when he's beat. He's coming back. Jesse lifted his chin, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. He's just finding work to tide us over. Then he'll be back for me and Moonfeather. Will he now? Crane's smile was all teeth and no warmth. And what makes you think there'll be anything left for him to come back to? The threat hung in the desert air like smoke. Jesse felt something cold crawl up his spine despite the blazing heat. Before his father's disgrace, the Hawthorne family had lived in the foreman's house, a real house with glass windows and a stone fireplace, not the converted root cellar where Jesse now spent his nights before Crane's accusations. Jesse had attended the schoolhouse in town, where Miss Sarah taught him letters and numbers and the names of faraway places. Before the lies, he'd had friends among the other ranch children, boys who'd race horses with him through the arroyos and share secrets beneath the cottonwood trees. Now, he had only Moonfeather. The stallion had been a gift from his grandfather before the old man vanished, a colt with eyes like midnight and a coat that shifted from silver to white depending on the light. This one's special grandson, Ayanna had said in his careful English, the Navajo words threading through like silver wire. He'll be your companion when the world grows dark. Jesse hadn't understood then what darkness his grandfather meant. Now, watching 5 rifle barrels trained on Moonfeather's heart, he understood with terrible clarity. Problem is, Crane was saying, that horse of yours has been causing me considerable inconvenience. Spooking my cattle, digging where he shouldn't, making my investors nervous about the stability of their investment. Jesse knew that was nonsense. Moonfeather was the gentlest creature in the territory, a horse who'd never shown aggression toward anything, except rattlesnakes and the occasional coyote. But the truth had stopped mattering the day Crane decided the Hawthorne family knew too much about his business. The real problem was what Moonfeather had uncovered near the cottonwood grove, those symbols that had seemed so familiar, so important. Jesse had tried to copy them in the dirt outside his shelter, working from memory, but they'd felt incomplete, like pieces of a puzzle that would reveal something dangerous if properly assembled. Besides, Crane continued, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Jesse's ears, I can't have reminders of your grandfather's activities roaming my land. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Thunder rolled overhead again, closer now. The storm clouds had crept across the sky while Jesse wasn't watching, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. The air tasted of electricity and distant rain, though Jesse had never seen a real storm in Perdition Creek. Only dust devils and empty promises. Moonfeather whinnied again, softer this time, and Jesse heard something almost like words in the sound. His grandfather had always claimed that horses spoke their own language, older than human speech, rooted in the same magic that made water flow uphill toward sacred places. "Please," Jesse whispered, all his pride crumbling away. "Take anything else. I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just don't fire." The word split the world in half. The rifles erupted in a thunderclap of smoke and flame that seemed to tear the very fabric of the afternoon apart. Jesse's scream died in his throat as he watched the bullets streak toward Moonfeather like harbingers of doom. But something impossible happened. The world stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Complete and absolute stillness descended over the courtyard like a blanket woven from silence itself. The gunsmoke hung motionless in the air, frozen gray wisps that should have been dissipating on the desert wind. The bullets themselves were visible, suspended in space like deadly metal insects caught in amber, their trajectories marked by shimmering distortions in the superheated air. Jesse blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the scene remained frozen, Crane with his mouth half open in triumph, the executioners locked in their firing positions, even a dust devil caught mid-spiral at the edge of the courtyard. The only sounds were Jesse's ragged breathing and the thunderous beating of his own heart. The hands gripping his shoulders had turned to stone. Jesse twisted free with surprising ease, stumbling forward on trembling legs toward his horse. Moonfeather stood statue still, but unlike the others, his eyes tracked Jesse's movement. Alive, alert, aware. "What's happening?" Jesse whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the motionless air. He reached up to touch Moonfeather's muzzle, and the stallion's breath was warm against his palm, the only other living thing in this suspended nightmare. Then he heard it, a voice like wind through canyon stones, speaking words in the old language his grandfather had taught him. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the earth itself and the storm-heavy sky above. "The blood of the medicine man flows in your veins, young one. The moment of choosing has come." Jesse spun around, searching for the speaker, but found only the frozen tableau of would-be murderers. "Grandfather?" he called out. "Grandfather, is that you?" The voice came again, closer now, carrying the scent of sage and old leather. "3 paths stretch before you, grandson of my blood. Choose quickly, for even stopped time cannot hold forever." As if summoned by the words, Jesse began to see them, shimmering trails of light that stretched out from where he stood like roads made of starlight. The first path led back toward the barn, glowing soft blue and whispering of safety, of hiding, of surviving by staying small and invisible. The second wound toward the town of Perdition Creek, burning orange with promises of help that would come too late, of adults who would ask questions but change nothing. But the third path blazed silver-white, leading straight toward the cottonwood grove where Moonfeather had found those strange symbols. This trail pulsed with power that made Jesse's skin tingle, but it also radiated danger like heat from a forge. Along its length he glimpsed flashes of impossible things. Underground chambers carved with the same symbols he'd seen in the dirt, a spring that bubbled with water clear as liquid crystal, and something else. A darkness that moved with purpose, hungry and ancient, and deeply wrong. "The sacred spring lies beneath the grove," the voice explained. "Your grandfather died protecting its location from those who would corrupt its power. But you, child of 2 bloodlines, might succeed where others have failed." Jesse's hands shook as understanding crashed over him. The symbols Moonfeather had uncovered weren't just random markings, they were a map, a guide to the mystical spring his grandfather's stories had always hinted at, the source of power over life and death that Crane had been searching for when he'd murdered Ayanna. "But the bullets," Jesse said, looking back at the frozen projectiles hanging in the air like metal wasps. "Even if I find the spring, I can't stop them. They're already—" "Time is a river, grandson. Rivers can be turned, dammed, made to flow backward, if one has the will and the knowledge. But the price is always steep. As if to demonstrate, Jesse took a step toward the silver-white path. Pain shot through his body, sudden and shocking. He looked down at his hands and gasped. The smooth skin was lined now, aged by months in the space of a single footfall. His reflection in Moonfeather's dark eye showed a face subtly changed, baby fat melting away to reveal sharper cheekbones, eyes that held knowledge they shouldn't possess. The terrible choice crystallized before him with perfect, agonizing clarity. He could follow the silver path to the spring, perhaps gain the power needed to save Moonfeather, but each step would steal away pieces of his childhood, aging him rapidly toward an adulthood he wasn't ready to face. Or he could choose safety, choose the blue path back to hiding, and watch his best friend die while he lived on in the shadows of Crane's cruelty. Thunder crashed overhead, though the storm clouds remained motionless. The frozen world shuddered slightly, like a held breath threatening to exhale. Choose quickly, grandson. The magic that stops the world cannot hold much longer, and some choices cannot be unmade. Jesse's bare feet remained planted in the dust as if they'd grown roots. The silver path beckoned before him, its ethereal light pulsing with each beat of his racing heart, but terror held him frozen more completely than any magic. What if I'm not strong enough? The thought clawed at him like a living thing. He was just a boy, 10 years old, small for his age, with arms that could barely lift a hay bale and legs that still carried him at a child's stumbling gait. The men who'd tried to reach his grandfather's spring before him had been warriors, medicine men with decades of training and wisdom. They'd all failed. They'd all died. And now the weight of that same impossible task pressed down on his narrow shoulders like a millstone. "I don't know how," he whispered to the frozen air, his voice cracking with desperation. "Grandfather, I don't know the old ways like you did. I can barely remember half the stories you told me." The aged lines on his hands seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, a constant reminder of what each step toward the spring would cost him. He flexed his fingers, watching the skin stretch differently now, feeling joints that ached with phantom decades. Was this how his father's hands would look in 20 years? Would Jesse even recognize himself if he reached the grove? "The knowledge sleeps in your blood," came his grandfather's voice, but it sounded more distant now, strained. "Trust what you feel, not what you think you know." But feeling was exactly the problem. Jesse felt everything. Terror so sharp it tasted like copper pennies, grief that threatened to drown him where he stood, and underneath it all, a rage so pure it frightened him. He wanted to hurt the men who'd done this, wanted to see Crane's smug face twisted with fear the way Jesse's had been twisted every night since his father left. That darkness in his heart, that hunger for revenge, wasn't that the same corruption his grandfather had died fighting against? What if Jesse reached the spring only to become the very evil Ayanna had sacrificed himself to stop? Moonfeather nickered softly, and Jesse caught his reflection again in the stallion's knowing eye. For just a moment, he saw not the aged features that magic had carved into his face, but something else entirely, a glimpse of the man he might become. Tall and weathered like his father, but with his grandfather's calm wisdom shining from eyes that had seen too much too young. It was a face that had learned to carry terrible burdens without being crushed by them. But that vision flickered and vanished, leaving only a frightened boy who wanted nothing more than to run away from this impossible choice. The blue path whispered seductively of safety. He could slip back to his root cellar hideout, wait for the world to start moving again, and pretend none of this had happened. Maybe the bullets would miss. Maybe Moonfeather would survive somehow. Maybe his father would return and make everything right again. Maybe. The word echoed in his skull like a mockery. He'd been living on maybes for months now. Maybe Papa would find work. Maybe Crane would leave them alone. Maybe everything would go back to the way it was before. But deep in his heart, Jesse knew better. He'd seen the cold certainty in Crane's eyes, the practiced efficiency of the hired guns. There would be no miraculous miss, no last-minute rescue. Moonfeather would die, and Jesse would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd had the power to prevent it, and chosen his own safety instead. The frozen world shuddered again, more violently this time. Hairline cracks appeared in the air itself, spiderwebbing out from the suspended bullets like fractures in glass. Whatever force had stopped time was weakening, and when it shattered completely, those projectiles would resume their deadly flight. Jesse's chest tightened as he calculated the distance. 30 yards to the silver path, perhaps another mile through the grove to reach the spring, if he could even find it. And every step would age him, stealing away months or years of the childhood he'd never get back. By the time he reached the sacred water, would he still be Jesse Hawthorne? Or would he be someone else entirely, shaped by magic into a creature he didn't recognize? The worst part was the loneliness of it. If he took that silver path, he'd be walking it alone, leaving behind the last remnants of his normal life forever. Even if he succeeded, even if he saved Moonfeather and stopped Crane, he could never go back to being just a boy playing with his horse in the desert. The weight of what he'd seen and done would mark him forever, set him apart from others his age like a brand burned into his soul. Thunder rolled overhead once more, and Jesse felt the frozen moment straining toward its breaking point. The choice that had seemed impossible was becoming inevitable, pushed forward by time itself. His grandfather's voice came one last time, barely audible now. "Courage is not the absence of fear, grandson. It is action in spite of fear." Jesse took a shaking breath and lifted one foot toward the silver path. His foot touched the silver light, and the transformation hit him like a physical blow. Fire raced through his bones as months collapsed into seconds. Jesse's spine stretched upward, his voice deepening mid-gasp as his larynx matured. The clothes that had fit him moments before pulled tight across broadening shoulders and lengthening limbs. But worse than the physical pain was the mental weight, memories that weren't his own flooding in like water through a broken dam. Knowledge of hurt and loss and the terrible complexity of adult choices crashed over him in waves. There was no going back now. The blue path of safety flickered and vanished behind him, severed the moment he'd chosen the silver road. Jesse stumbled forward, his changed body unfamiliar, each step carrying him further from the boy he'd been and deeper into something ancient and dangerous. The silver light guided him away from the frozen tableau of execution, past Crane's motionless form and the suspended gunman. Jesse found himself moving with purpose he didn't fully understand, his grandfather's blood singing in his veins like a compass needle pointing toward magnetic north. The path led him through the scattered buildings of Perdition Creek, past the empty schoolhouse where he'd never sit again, beyond the last fence posts that marked the edge of civilized territory. Here, the desert opened up before him like a vast ocean of red stone and scrub brush. The cottonwood grove shimmered in the distance, a green oasis that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. But between Jesse and his destination lay a wasteland that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Too quiet, too still, as if even the desert creatures knew to avoid this place. With each step, more years settled on him like dust. His hands roughened and scarred themselves with labor he'd never performed. His face lost the last softness of childhood, carving itself into angles that spoke of hardship and responsibility. By the time he reached the first skeletal mesquite trees at the grove's edge, Jesse estimated he'd aged 5 years, maybe 6. His reflection in a scattered puddle showed a teenager's face staring back, still recognizably himself, but marked by an adulthood that felt borrowed, unearned. The grove itself was older than he'd expected. These cottonwoods had grown here for centuries, their massive trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like living hieroglyphs spelling out messages in a language of bark and branch. Spanish moss hung from their limbs like tattered prayer flags, and the air beneath their canopy carried scents that belonged to no desert Jesse had ever known. Rich loam and flowing water and something else, something that made the hair on his newly mature arms stand on end. The symbols Moonfeather had uncovered were everywhere once Jesse learned to look for them. Carved into tree trunks, pressed into the soft earth, even outlined in the way certain branches had grown over the decades. They formed a spiral pattern that drew the eye inward toward the heart of the grove where the largest cottonwood stood sentinel over secrets buried in its shadow. Jesse's transformed hands shook as he knelt beside the ancient tree's base. The symbols here were different, fresher, cut deep into the wood with a blade that had left marks still sharp decades later. His grandfather's work, he realized. Ayana's final message, hidden where only one of his own blood would think to look. Beneath the grandfather tree, Jesse whispered, the words coming to him in his grandfather's voice, as if Ayana were speaking through him. Where the roots drink from the sacred spring, the ground here felt different under his palms, hollow somehow, as if vast spaces lay hidden beneath the thin shell of earth and rock. Jesse began to dig with desperate efficiency, his aged hands remembering calluses they'd never earned, his back accepting the strain of labor with muscles that had grown strong through magic instead of time. 3 feet down, his fingers struck carved stone. The underground chamber revealed itself slowly, inch by painstaking inch. Ancient steps led down into darkness that seemed to swallow his grandfather's silver light, but Jesse descended anyway, driven by necessity and the knowledge that time was fracturing above ground with each moment he delayed. The bullets hung in the air over Moonfeather would not wait forever. At the bottom of the steps, Jesse found himself in a circular room whose walls pulsed with their own phosphorescent glow. The symbols here covered every surface, not carved but grown, as if the stone itself had shaped these marks from within. And at the chamber's heart, exactly as his grandfather's stories had promised, bubbled a spring of water so clear it seemed made of liquid starlight. Jesse approached the sacred pool on trembling legs, feeling the weight of every choice that had led him here pressing down like the earth above. This was the crossing point, the threshold between the boy he'd been and whatever he was meant to become. The water sang with power older than memory, promising answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. But first, he had to be willing to pay the price of those answers. Jesse knelt at the spring's edge, his reflection wavering in water that held depths no earthly pool should possess. The liquid starlight beckoned, but even as he reached toward its surface, shadows began moving in the chamber's periphery, shapes that had no business existing in a world of stone and ancient light. "Do not drink hastily, grandson." His grandfather's voice carried new urgency now, and Jesse understood why as the shadows coalesced into forms that made his newly mature mind reel. Warriors stepped from the walls themselves, Navajo braves who had died protecting this place across generations, their ghostly forms bearing wounds that spoke of desperate final stands. But these weren't the enemies Jesse feared. The true threat announced itself with laughter that echoed wrong in the sacred space. Well, well, the little coyote found his way to grandmother's den after all. Jesse spun toward the chamber's entrance, his heart hammering against ribs that had broadened with his magical aging. Silas Crane descended the ancient steps, but not the frozen Crane from the execution ground. This version moved with fluid grace, his eyes burning with an inner fire that had nothing to do with human ambition. "Impossible," Jesse breathed. "You're still up there, frozen with the others." Crane's smile revealed teeth that gleamed too sharp in the phosphorescent glow. "Time flows differently here, boy. Your grandfather learned that lesson the hard way." He gestured to the ghostly warriors who had arranged themselves in a protective circle around the spring, as did all his noble defenders. "He is drunk from corrupted waters," came Ayana's voice, and Jesse saw his grandfather's spirit materializing among the ancient guardians. The dark spring that feeds on death and grows stronger with each life, it claims. Understanding crashed over Jesse like a physical blow. There were 2 springs, the sacred one that granted power over life and death through sacrifice and wisdom, and its shadow twin that offered the same gifts through murder and corruption. Crane had found the dark spring first, years ago, and had been feeding it ever since. "Every homesteader I've driven off, every competitor I've crushed, every inconvenient truth I've buried," Crane continued, his form beginning to shift and blur at the edges, "all of it feeding my patron's spring, making me stronger. Your grandfather thought he could stop me by hiding this place, but he only delayed the inevitable." The ghostly warriors raised spectral weapons, but Crane laughed again, and the sound shattered their forms like glass. Raw power radiated from him now, Not the clean silver light of the sacred spring, but something oily and wrong that made the ancient symbols on the walls writhe in apparent pain. Jesse's hands shook as he cupped water from the true spring. "The rules," he demanded, his voice cracking despite his aged vocal cords. "What are the rules here?" "Wisdom before power," his grandfather's spirit replied, even as Crane advanced with predatory grace. "The sacred spring tests all who would drink, but you have already begun the first test by aging yourself to reach this place. Each year you sacrificed proves your commitment." Crane snarled and lunged forward, his corrupted power lashing out like black lightning. The attack struck Jesse's chest and sent him sprawling, but where he expected agony, he felt only a strange warmth. The water in his cupped hands glowed brighter, responding to his need. "The second test is courage in the face of overwhelming force," Ayanna continued. "Your enemy has the strength of 100 murders behind him. You have only your will and the wisdom of those who came before." More ghosts materialized, not just warriors now, but medicine men and wise women, children who had died defending their sacred places, even animals whose spirits had been bound to this chamber across centuries of protection. All of them had faced the same choice Jesse now confronted: drink from the spring and accept its gifts along with its terrible responsibilities, or die with their potential unfulfilled. But Jesse also sensed something else moving in the darkness beyond Crane. Other presences that felt hungry and ancient and deeply patient. The corrupted cattle baron wasn't the only threat here. The dark spring had guardians of its own, creatures that had been feeding on death and violence for so long they'd forgotten any other sustenance. "Choose quickly, boy," Crane hissed, his form now more shadow than flesh. "Drink and face me as an equal, or die as the child you're pretending not to be." Jesse looked into the sacred water one last time and saw not his reflection, but visions of possible futures. Moonfeather alive and free, Crane's empire of cruelty crumbling, himself standing as guardian between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. But he also saw the costs, the loneliness of power, the weight of decisions that would affect countless lives. The knowledge that he could never again be just a boy with simple dreams. The chamber shuddered as time itself began to fracture around them. "The third test is acceptance," his grandfather whispered. "Not just of power, but of what you must become to wield it wisely." Jesse lifted the starlit water to his lips. The sacred water touched Jesse's lips like liquid lightning, and the world exploded into sensation beyond anything his transformed body could have prepared for. Power flooded through him, not the slow burn of aging magic, but a torrent that rewrote him from the inside out. His bones sang with ancient songs, his blood carried the memories of every guardian who had ever protected this place, and his mind expanded to hold knowledge that spanned centuries. But even as the spring's gifts settled into his flesh, Crane struck. The cattle baron's corrupted power slammed into Jesse like a freight train, sending him tumbling across the chamber's stone floor. Where Crane's darkness touched the sacred symbols, they blackened and writhed, the very walls crying out in pain. Jesse rolled aside as another blast shattered the ground where his head had been, feeling the awful heat of corrupted magic scorching the air. "Focus, grandson," Ayanna's voice cut through the chaos. "The spring has given you what you need, but you must learn to wield it." Jesse pushed himself upright, his body still adjusting to the transformation. He was taller now, his frame filled out with the strength of a young man in his prime, but more than that, the water had awakened something in his blood that felt older than memory. When he raised his hands, silver light flowed from his palms like moonbeams given substance. "Pretty tricks," Crane snarled, his form shifting between man and shadow. "But I've had decades to master my gifts. You're still just a frightened boy playing with forces beyond his understanding." The accusation stung because part of it was true. Beneath the magical transformation, beneath the ancient knowledge now flowing through his veins, Jesse could still feel the 10-year-old boy who had watched helplessly as the gunmen raised their rifles. That scared child lived inside him still, whimpering that this was too much, too fast, too impossible. Crane pressed his attack, waves of dark power crashing against Jesse's hastily raised defenses. Each impact drove him backward, closer to the sacred spring. The ghostly guardians tried to intervene, but their spectral weapons passed harmlessly through Crane's corrupted form. This was Jesse's battle to fight. You feel it, don't you? Crane's voice carried a hypnotic quality now, speaking directly to Jesse's deepest fears. The weight of what you've taken on. The responsibility crushing down on shoulders too young to bear it. You could have stayed safe in your hiding place, let events unfold as they would. But no, you had to play the hero. Jesse's silver light flickered as doubt crept into his heart. How many had died because someone thought they knew better? How many tragedies had begun with good intentions twisted by pride and certainty? The chamber shuddered again, and Jesse felt the frozen world above them straining toward collapse. Moonfeather was still up there, still caught in that terrible moment between life and death. Whatever happened in this underground battle, it had to happen fast. Remember why you came here, his grandfather's spirit urged. Not for glory or power, but for love. That love is your strength. Let it guide you. Love. Jesse thought of Moonfeather's gentle eyes, of his father's calloused hands teaching him to ride, of his grandfather's patient voice sharing the old stories. That warmth spread through his chest, steadying his hands, clarifying his purpose. This wasn't about proving himself or seeking revenge. It was about protection, about standing between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. Jesse's silver light blazed brighter, but instead of lashing out at Crane, he turned and plunged his transformed hands into the sacred spring itself. "What are you—" Crane's question cut off, as the water responded to Jesse's touch, its starlight glow spreading outward in ripples that climbed the chamber walls. The ancient symbols blazed with renewed power, and the ghostly guardians solidified into forms that could finally act. But Jesse wasn't trying to fight Crane directly. Through his connection to the spring, he could feel the fabric of time itself, could sense the fracture lines spreading through the frozen moment above ground. The magic that had stopped time was unraveling, but maybe, just maybe, he could guide that unraveling. "You think you can rewind it all?" Crane laughed, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Change what's already been set in motion?" "Not change," Jesse said, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to his grandfather's spirit. "Redirect." The sacred spring's power flowed through him and up through the earth, racing toward the surface where bullets hung suspended and executioners stood frozen. Jesse felt each projectile like a physical weight, felt the momentum trapped within them, the deadly intent that drove their flight. He couldn't erase that intent. The springs granted power over life and death, not the ability to unmake choices already made. But he could guide it, shape it, turn it aside at the crucial moment. The chamber filled with blinding light as two magics, sacred and corrupted, met in final confrontation. Above them, time prepared to shatter like glass, and Jesse steeled himself for the battle that would determine not just Moonfeather's fate, but the future of Perdition Creek itself. The blinding light erupted outward with the force of a thunderclap, and Jesse felt reality itself convulse around them. Through his connection to the sacred spring, he sensed the moment above ground fracturing like ice under pressure, time resuming its flow in jagged, unpredictable bursts. But Crane's corrupted power fought back with savage intensity, pouring decades of accumulated death magic into preventing Jesse's intervention. "You understand nothing," Crane roared, his form now more darkness than flesh. "Those bullets will find their mark whether you guide them or not. Death feeds death. It's the only law that matters." The chamber walls cracked as competing magics tore at the ancient stones. Jesse felt the weight of Crane's accumulated murders pressing against him like a physical force, every homesteader driven to despair, every rival crushed beneath the cattle baron's ambition, every life snuffed out to feed the dark spring's hunger. The sheer volume of corruption threatened to overwhelm Jesse's newfound power. But worse than the magical assault was what Jesse glimpsed in the waters themselves. As his consciousness expanded through the sacred spring's network, he saw the true scope of the choice before him. The bullets hung above ground weren't just aimed at Moonfeather. Crane had orchestrated this execution as a ritual sacrifice, the horse's death meant to crack open something far more terrible. He seeks to merge the springs. His grandfather's voice carried desperate urgency, to corrupt the sacred waters and claim dominion over both life and death. Jesse's hands burned where they touched the spring's surface, the starlight water growing scalding hot as Crane's influence pressed closer. Through the liquid connection, he felt tendrils of darkness creeping toward the sacred chamber, not just Crane's power, but something far older. The dark spring itself, rising from whatever hellish depths had birthed it, eager to devour its opposite. "I wondered how long it would take you to understand." Crane laughed, his voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "Your horse was never the target, boy, it was bait. Every step you've taken, every choice you've made, all of it leading here, to this moment when you'd pour yourself into the sacred waters and make them vulnerable." Horror flooded through Jesse as he realized the trap's full scope. By connecting himself so deeply to the spring, he'd created a bridge between the sacred and corrupted waters. Crane didn't need to defeat him in direct combat. He only needed to follow that connection back to its source. The ghostly guardians sensed the danger and pressed their attack, but their spectral weapons still passed harmlessly through Crane's transformed state. They could act now, but not against something that had drunk so deeply from the dark spring's power. Only Jesse possessed the living connection necessary to affect Crane directly, which meant he had to sever his link to the sacred waters and face Crane with whatever power he'd already absorbed, power that felt pitiful compared to decades of accumulated corruption. Jesse began to pull his hands from the spring, but the moment he started withdrawing, he felt time shudder above ground. Without his guidance, the frozen moment would collapse chaotically. The bullets would resume their flight, but where they struck would be random chance rather than careful redirection. Moonfeather might live, or die even more horribly than before. "Choose quickly," Crane hissed, darkness streaming from his form toward the sacred waters. "Abandon your connection and watch your horse die by random chance, or maintain it and watch everything you love be consumed by forces you helped unleash." The chamber filled with the sound of cracking stone as competing magics tore at reality's foundations. Jesse felt years of his life burning away with each second of contact, the sacred spring demanding ever greater sacrifice to maintain its purity against Crane's assault. He was aging again, but differently now. Not the gradual transformation that had brought him here, but a rapid consumption that spoke of true costs being paid. "There is another way," Ayana's spirit whispered, his voice barely audible over the magical chaos. "But it requires sacrifice beyond what you have already given." Through the spring's connection, Jesse glimpsed what his grandfather meant. He could redirect more than just the bullets' paths. He could redirect their very nature, transform projectiles of death into carriers of the sacred spring's power. It would send purifying energy racing through Perdition Creek's corrupted heart, cleansing decades of accumulated darkness. But the effort would drain the sacred spring entirely, rendering it powerless for generations to come. And Jesse himself would bear the cost, not death, but something that might be worse. He would become the spring's living vessel, carrying its power in his flesh, but forever bound to its purpose. Never again just a boy, never again free to choose his own path. The darkness reached the spring's edge, and Jesse felt Crane's corruption beginning to seep into the starlight waters. Moonfeather's life hung in the balance above, while below, the fate of every innocent soul in Perdition Creek waited on his decision. Jesse looked into the sacred waters one final time and saw his own 10-year-old face staring back, the boy he had been, the child he was choosing to leave behind forever. Jesse made his choice. He drove his consciousness deeper into the sacred spring than any guardian had ever dared, feeling the ancient waters rush through his very soul. The starlight liquid responded to his desperate plea, gathering itself for one final, catastrophic release of power. But as the magic built toward its crescendo, Crane struck with everything he possessed. The dark spring's corruption slammed into Jesse's mind like a battering ram of pure malevolence. Every murder Crane had committed, every life twisted to feed the shadow waters, all of it poured through their connection in a torrent of anguish that threatened to shatter Jesse's sanity. He felt his grandfather's death as if it were happening now, experienced the slow starvation of driven-out homesteaders, witnessed children crying over graves that should never have been dug. "You cannot bear this alone," his grandfather's spirit cried out, but even Ayana's voice sounded distant now, overwhelmed by the chaos of competing magics. Jesse's transformed body convulsed as the sacred spring's power tore through him, each pulse aging him further. But it was wrong somehow. The magic felt different than before, tainted by proximity to Crane's corruption. The pristine starlight waters were turning gray at the edges, their purity compromised by the very connection Jesse had forged. "Yes," Crane hissed in triumph. "Feel it happening, boy. Your noble sacrifice is poisoning the very thing you sought to protect. The sacred spring drinks from your pain now, learns the taste of desperation and fear." Through his fragmenting awareness, Jesse felt the truth of those words like physical blows. The spring had always demanded sacrifice, but willing sacrifice given in wisdom and love. What Jesse offered now was different, desperate, terrified, born from impossible circumstances rather than understanding. The ancient waters couldn't distinguish between the purity of his intentions and the corruption of his methods. Above ground, time fractured completely. Jesse felt the frozen moment explode into chaos as his control shattered. The bullets resumed their flight, but not along the gentle paths he'd tried to create. Instead, they careened wildly, some striking earth, others spinning off into empty air, and at least one heading directly for Moonfeather's heart with renewed velocity. "No!" Jesse tried to surge upward through the spring's connection, but Crane's power held him trapped in the chamber. The cattle baron's form had become a writhing mass of shadow now, fed by the dark spring's hunger and growing stronger with each moment of Jesse's anguish. The ghostly guardians pressed forward desperately, their spectral forms beginning to fray as the chamber's protective magic failed. Without the sacred spring's pure power to anchor them, they were fading back into whatever realm housed the dead. Even his grandfather's spirit grew translucent, the silver light of his presence dimming toward extinction. "Forgive me," Ayana whispered. "I led you to this place believing you could succeed where I failed, but some evils are too vast for any single soul to overcome." Jesse felt his connection to the surface world stretching toward its breaking point. The magical link that had allowed him to perceive events above ground was dissolving, which meant soon he wouldn't even know if Moonfeather lived or died. He would be trapped here in this corrupted chamber, bound to springs that could no longer be called sacred, while everything he'd fought to protect crumbled to ash. Crane's laughter echoed from the walls as darkness spread through the starlight waters like ink through milk. "Did you truly believe love could overcome decades of careful planning? Your grandfather thought the same thing, right up until I cut his throat and fed his blood to my patron spring." The accusation hit Jesse like a physical blow, but buried within it was something else, a discordant note that didn't match Crane's usual arrogant certainty. Jesse's fragmenting consciousness seized on that inconsistency, following it back through the magical connection between them. What he found there changed everything. Crane hadn't just drunk from the dark spring, he'd bound himself to it so completely that his human identity was more memory than reality. The creature speaking through his mouth was something far older and hungrier, something that had been feeding on death and corruption since before the first humans walked these lands. Crane himself was as much a victim as anyone else, his soul devoured years ago by forces he'd thought he could control. But that revelation came too late. Jesse felt his own essence beginning to fray at the edges, pulled apart by magics too powerful for his inexperienced soul to contain. The sacred spring's remaining power was draining away through the corruption Crane had introduced, and without it, Jesse couldn't maintain the transformation that had brought him this far. He was becoming a child again, but not the innocent boy who had cradled Moonfeather in that terrible frozen moment. This was something broken, aged beyond his years by exposure to horrors no young mind should witness, carrying knowledge that would poison any chance at a normal life. Above ground, he felt Moonfeather's heart stop beating. The moment Moonfeather's heart went silent, Everything Jesse thought he understood about magic and sacrifice and the nature of life itself collapsed into revelation. The connection between boy and horse, forged through years of whispered secrets and shared dreams, strengthened by the sacred spring's power, made eternal by love deeper than death, didn't break when Moonfeather died. Instead, it completed something that had been building since the first moment Jesse laid hands on the starlight waters. Through that bond, Jesse felt Moonfeather's spirit rise from the frozen tableau above ground. But instead of departing for whatever realm awaited animal souls, the horse's essence flowed downward through layers of stone and earth, drawn by the same power that had transformed Jesse himself. The white stallion's spirit descended like silver fire into the corrupted chamber, and where it touched the gray-tainted waters, they blazed with renewed purity. Crane's triumphant laughter cut off abruptly as starlight erupted around them. "Impossible," the shadow thing wearing his face snarled. "Death feeds death, that is the law." But Jesse finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along. The springs, both sacred and corrupted, weren't sources of power, they were vessels for it. And the true power had always been the connections between living souls, the bonds of love and loyalty and sacrifice willingly given. Moonfeather's spirit settled around Jesse like a mantle of silver light, and suddenly the boy could see clearly through the chaos of competing magics. Crane wasn't the master of the dark spring, he was its slave, hollowed out and filled with something ancient and hungry. The real Silas Crane had died years ago, consumed by forces he'd thought he could control, leaving behind only a puppet animated by collective malevolence. More than that, Jesse could see the true scope of the corruption spreading beneath Perdition Creek. The dark spring wasn't natural, it was a wound in the earth itself, torn open by accumulated anguish and fed by generations of greed and violence. Every murder, every act of cruelty, every moment when humans chose hatred over love had fed that festering darkness until it gained a will of its own. The sacred spring existed to balance it, to offer healing and renewal against the shadow's hunger. But the springs alone were powerless. They required living souls to channel their influence, guardians willing to bridge the gap between mortal and eternal. "You begin to understand," his grandfather's spirit said, blazing brighter now that Moonfeather's essence had joined their cause. "But understanding is only the first step." Jesse felt the weight of choice settling around him again, but this time he saw clearly what was being offered. He could accept the role of guardian completely, binding himself to the sacred spring as thoroughly as Crane had bound himself to its opposite. He would gain the power to drive back the corruption, to cleanse Perdition Creek's wounds and protect future generations from the shadow's influence. But the cost would be his humanity itself, not just his childhood, his entire mortal existence. He would become something between boy and spirit, alive but not living, human but no longer entirely earthbound. The Jesse who loved riding beneath open skies and dreamed of adventures beyond the horizon would cease to exist, replaced by something eternal and necessary and utterly alone. Through their bond, he felt Moonfeather's gentle understanding. The horse's spirit pressed against his consciousness, offering wordless comfort and support for whatever choice Jesse made. There was no judgment there, no expectation, only love pure enough to transcend the boundary between life and death. Above ground, Jesse sensed the frozen moment finally collapsing. Time resumed its flow as the bullets completed their interrupted flight, but without his direct guidance, their paths remained chaotic. Some struck earth, others whistled harmlessly into empty air. But Moonfeather's body lay still in the dust, beyond the reach of earthly salvation. Crane's shadow form pressed closer, darkness streaming from his corrupted essence toward the sacred waters. "Choose quickly, boy. Accept the binding and watch yourself disappear into duty and obligation, or reject it and let everything you love fall to shadow." Jesse looked into the starlight waters one final time and saw not his own reflection, but the faces of everyone who would suffer if he failed. His father, drinking himself into oblivion over guilt that wasn't his to bear. The homesteaders driven from their land by Crane's expanding cruelty. Children yet unborn who would inherit a world poisoned by unchecked malevolence. But he also saw what he would lose: the simple joy of a boy's laughter, the warmth of his father's rough affection, the dream of growing up to become something more than duty and sacrifice. All of it balanced against the weight of responsibility he'd never asked for but could no longer deny. Moonfeather's spirit wrapped around him like starlight given form, and in that gentle embrace, Jesse found his answer. Love demanded sacrifice, but it also provided the strength to bear that sacrifice without bitterness. He reached deeper into the sacred waters and accepted the binding completely. The chamber exploded into silver fire. The silver fire consumed everything, not with destructive heat, but with a purifying radiance that rewrote the very essence of matter and spirit. Jesse felt his consciousness expand beyond the confines of his transformed body as the sacred spring's power flooded through him completely. But instead of the agonizing drain he'd experienced before, this felt like coming home to himself for the first time. Moonfeather's spirit merged with the starlight waters, and through their eternal bond, Jesse understood what was happening. The binding wasn't destroying his humanity, it was completing it. Every moment of love he'd shared with the white stallion, every whispered secret and shared dream, had been preparing him for this transformation. He wasn't losing his identity, he was becoming the truest version of himself. The silver fire spread outward from the spring in waves, and wherever it touched, corruption withered. Jesse watched through his expanded awareness as decades of accumulated darkness began to dissolve like smoke before dawn. Crane's shadow form screamed as the purifying light reached him, but the sound held more relief than anguish. The real Silas Crane, the man who had existed before the dark spring's influence consumed him, crying out in gratitude as his trapped soul was finally freed. "Thank you," the cattle baron's human voice whispered as his borrowed flesh crumbled to ash. "I've been so cold for so long." The ancient hunger that had worn Crane's face like a mask writhed in fury as its puppet was stripped away, but without a living vessel to anchor it, the entity began dissolving back into the dark spring's poisoned depths. Jesse felt its alien rage battering against the sacred light, but the silver fire held firm, fed by bonds stronger than death itself. Through the chamber's walls, Jesse sensed the corruption retreating throughout Perdition Creek's foundation. The wound in the earth wasn't healing, that would take generations of careful tending, but it was no longer spreading. The balance his grandfather had died trying to protect was finally restored. "Well done, my grandson," Ayana's spirit said, and Jesse could hear the profound relief in that ancient voice. "But your work is not finished. The binding grants you power, but you must learn to use it wisely." Jesse felt knowledge flowing into his transformed consciousness, not just magical understanding, but the accumulated wisdom of every guardian who had served the sacred spring throughout the centuries. He saw glimpses of other battles against darkness, other moments when the balance had teetered on the edge of collapse. Always, it came down to individuals willing to sacrifice everything for love of something greater than themselves. But he also sensed something the previous guardians had never possessed: Moonfeather's enduring presence. The horse's spirit hadn't been consumed by the transformation. It had become Jesse's eternal companion, a constant reminder of the joy and innocence that gave meaning to their shared sacrifice. "The springs are balanced for now," his grandfather continued, "but vigilance remains necessary. You must choose whether to remain below as guardian, or return to the surface and face what your absence has wrought." Jesse turned his attention upward, feeling through the earth to the frozen tableau he'd left behind. The bullets had completed their flight, but Moonfeather's body lay still in the dust where he'd fallen. Jesse's father knelt beside the white stallion, tears carving tracks through the grime on his weathered face. The masked executioners had vanished, puppets abandoned when their master was destroyed, but the townspeople of Perdition Creek stood in confused clusters, struggling to understand what they had witnessed. And there, barely visible in the shadow of the gallows, stood the 10-year-old boy Jesse had been mere hours ago. The sacred spring's power had created a temporal echo, preserving the moment of his departure while his consciousness traveled deeper into mystery. That child waited with infinite patience, knowing somehow that his older self would return with power enough to reshape this tragic day. Jesse felt Moonfeather's spirit stirring with gentle urgency. The horse's essence carried a wordless message. Their work together was just beginning. The sacred spring's balance had been restored, but the people of Perdition Creek would need guidance to heal the wounds Crane's influence had torn in their community. Children would need protection from the lingering shadows that still haunted the desert's hidden places. And somewhere in the vast network of springs and sacred sites that crisscrossed the frontier, other guardians might be fighting their own desperate battles against encroaching darkness. Jesse smiled, feeling young again despite the ancient wisdom now burning in his mind. The binding had given him the power to preserve his essential self while gaining the strength necessary to protect those he loved. He wouldn't lose his father's rough affection or the simple joys of a boy's laughter. He would simply carry them forward into whatever adventures awaited. "Are you ready?" Moonfeather's spirit asked in the wordless language they had always shared. Jesse gathered the silver fire around him like a cloak and began his ascent towards sunlight and possibility. Behind him, the sacred spring pulsed with renewed vitality, its starlight waters no longer tainted by shadow. Ahead lay Perdition Creek, wounded but salvageable, waiting for its new guardian to emerge from the depths and begin the long work of healing. The ascent through solid stone felt like swimming through liquid starlight. Jesse's transformed consciousness rode the silver fire upward, Moonfeather's spirit flowing beside him like a river of gentle radiance. With each foot of earth they traversed, Jesse felt the weight of his new responsibilities settling more firmly around his shoulders, not crushing, but substantial as a well-fitted saddle. The temporal echo of his younger self grew stronger as they approached the surface. Jesse could sense that 10-year-old boy's confused terror, the way his small hands had trembled as he'd pressed them against the sacred spring's waters in desperate hope. That child had acted on pure instinct and love, never understanding the magnitude of forces he was unleashing. Now Jesse carried the wisdom to guide those same forces with purpose. "Remember," his grandfather's voice whispered through the connection between springs, "power without restraint becomes corruption. You have seen what Crane's hunger wrought. Do not let righteousness become its own form of blindness." The warning settled deep into Jesse's bones as the silver fire brought him within reach of sunlight. Through his expanded awareness, he felt the chaos his absence had created in Perdition Creek. Without Crane's malevolent will to direct them, his hired guns had scattered to the winds, but their departure left a vacuum of authority that threatened to tear the town apart. Some citizens demanded immediate justice for decades of oppression, while others cowered in fear of retribution from Crane's remaining allies. His father still knelt beside Moonfeather's fallen form, but Ben Hawthorne's grief had transformed into something harder and more dangerous. Jesse sensed his father's intention to hunt down every man who had participated in the execution, to paint the desert red with vengeance regardless of the cost. That path would only feed the Dark Spring's wounded hunger, perpetuating the cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed everything Jesse loved. The moment had come for choices that would echo through generations. Jesse's consciousness merged with his younger self in a burst of silver radiance that sent shockwaves through the frozen air above Perdition Creek. The 10-year-old boy's form dissolved like morning mist, replaced by something that was neither child nor adult but possessed the best qualities of both. Jesse stood in the dusty street with ancient wisdom burning behind young eyes, starlight threading through his dark hair like premature silver. Around him, the townspeople staggered backward as reality reasserted itself. The bullets that had hung suspended in mid-flight completed their trajectories harmlessly, embedding themselves in wooden posts and adobe walls. The gallows where Moonfeather had been condemned creaked once and collapsed into splinters, as if the wood itself rejected the memory of injustice. But Jesse's attention focused entirely on his father's anguished face. Ben Hawthorne looked up from Moonfeather's still form with eyes that held a dangerous combination of grief and rage. "Boy, where have you been?" His voice cracked like breaking leather. "They killed him, Jesse. They killed our horse, and I'm going to make every last one of them pay." "No, Pa." Jesse's voice carried harmonics that hadn't been there before, echoes of deep waters and ancient songs. "That's not the way. He knelt beside Moonfeather's body and placed both hands on the white stallion's chest. The horse's flesh was still warm, though no breath stirred his flanks. Through their eternal bond, Jesse felt Moonfeather's spirit hovering just beyond the veil, waiting for permission to return. The choice before Jesse was enormous. He possessed the power to reverse death itself, to call Moonfeather's soul back into his earthly body and undo the tragedy that had started this entire journey. The sacred spring's purified energy surged through him, more than sufficient for such a miracle. But wisdom held him back. Moonfeather had died protecting Jesse's escape into the depths, had willingly sacrificed himself so that the greater darkness could be defeated. To undo that sacrifice now would dishonor the horse's courage and possibly disturb the delicate balance they had fought so hard to restore. Instead, Jesse channeled the silver fire into a different kind of miracle. Under his hands, Moonfeather's body began to glow with soft radiance. The bullet wounds closed without scars, the dust and blood faded away, and the white stallion's coat took on an almost ethereal luster. When Jesse lifted his hands, Moonfeather looked not dead but peacefully sleeping, as if he might wake at any moment. "He's at rest now," Jesse said, meeting his father's bewildered stare, "but not gone, never gone." Ben Hawthorne reached out with trembling fingers to touch the glowing mane. "I don't understand any of this, boy. What's happened to you? What's happening to our town?" Jesse stood slowly, feeling the weight of his guardian's mantle settling into its permanent place. Around them, the people of Perdition Creek watched with a mixture of awe and terror as he prepared to speak words that would reshape their understanding of justice and mercy. The final confrontation wouldn't be fought with guns or violence, but with the far more difficult weapons of wisdom and forgiveness. Jesse looked out at the faces surrounding him, weathered ranchers, shop owners who had cowered under Crane's rule, former victims of the cattle baron's greed, and a few remaining supporters who didn't yet understand their master was gone forever. Each person carried their own burden of pain, their own hunger for either vengeance or absolution. The weight of their expectations pressed against his consciousness like a physical force. This was his final test, not facing down ancient spirits or corrupted springs, but confronting the hardest truth of all, that real justice required something far more difficult than defeating evil. It required healing the wounds that evil left behind. "People of Perdition Creek," Jesse began, his transformed voice carrying clearly across the dusty square, "I know you're afraid. I know you're angry. For years you've lived under Silas Crane's shadow, watching him take what he wanted, hurt who he pleased, and poison everything good in this town." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Old Pete Garrison, the general store owner, stepped forward with his hat clutched in gnarled hands. "Boy, I seen what you done down there in the earth. Seen the light and felt the ground shake when that darkness broke apart. But Crane still got men out there, still got money and influence. What's to stop them from coming back to finish what they started?" Jesse felt Moonfeather's spirit flowing around him like a gentle current, offering strength and clarity. "Crane's power was built on fear and corruption, Mr. Garrison. Those things can't survive in the light. Watch." He gestured toward the massive ranch house that dominated the western end of town, Crane's fortress of wealth and intimidation. As the silver fire flowed through Jesse's consciousness, the building began to change. The dark timbers lightened, taking on the warm honey color of new wood. Windows that had been shuttered and barred swung open to welcome sunlight. The high walls designed to keep people out crumbled into dust, while gardens of desert flowers erupted from the earth to replace them. "The land remembers what it was before greed poisoned it," Jesse said, watching the crowd's amazement grow. "Now it's returning to its true nature." But Sarah McKenna, whose husband had been trampled by Crane's horses for daring to claim water rights, pushed through the crowd with fury burning in her eyes. "Pretty words and magic tricks won't bring back the dead, boy. Won't undo the years of suffering. Justice demands payment in blood." Her pain hit Jesse like a physical blow. Through his expanded awareness, he could feel similar anguish radiating from dozens of other survivors. Families destroyed, dreams shattered, innocence lost to one man's insatiable hunger for power. The sacred spring's energy responded to his emotional state, silver light flickering around his hands as he struggled to contain the urge to simply force healing upon them all. But forced healing would be just another form of violation. True restoration had to be chosen freely. "You're right, Mrs. McKenna," Jesse said quietly. "Magic can't undo the past, but it can prevent the same darkness from taking root again. Look closely at your neighbors. How many of them worked for Crane because they were afraid? How many stayed silent when they should have spoken? How many of us carry some share of responsibility for letting things get so bad?" His father made a strangled sound of protest, but Jesse continued, "I'm not saying anyone here is as guilty as Crane himself, but hatred spreads like poison, and if we respond to his evil with more evil, we'll become the very thing we fought against." Sarah's fury wavered, replaced by something more complex and painful. "Then what do you propose, boy? That we just forgive and forget? Pretend none of it happened?" Jesse knelt beside Moonfeather's peaceful form and placed one hand on the horse's glowing mane. The contact sent ripples of silver light through the ground, and suddenly everyone present could feel what Jesse felt. Moonfeather's eternal presence, undiminished by death, offering forgiveness without condition. Remember, yes, honor the dead by living better than those who killed them. The corruption that wore Crane's face fed on hatred and fear and the desire for revenge. Every time we choose mercy over vengeance, love over anger, we make it weaker. The crowd fell silent as the implications settled over them. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation they had expected, no final battle between good and evil, no satisfying moment of watching justice served with violence. Instead, Jesse was asking them to do something infinitely harder, to transform themselves. Ben Hawthorne was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. "And if we choose wrong? If some of Crane's men come back looking for payback?" Jesse smiled, and for a moment, the ancient wisdom in his eyes gave way to something purely boyish. "Then I'll be here, Pa. We'll face it together." The silver fire pulsed brighter around them all, carrying with it a promise of protection and a challenge to become worthy of that protection. The final test had begun, not for Jesse alone, but for every soul in Perdition Creek. The silver fire that surrounded them suddenly flared brighter, and Jesse felt the familiar chill of ancient malevolence rising from the depths below. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. "The binding grants you power, but you must learn to use it wisely." As something vast and hungry stirred beneath Perdition Creek's foundation. The crowd gasped as shadows began seeping up through cracks in the dusty street, coalescing into a form that made Jesse's blood turn to ice water. It wasn't Crane. The cattle baron's corrupted flesh had crumbled to ash deep in the sacred chamber. This was the entity that had worn Crane's face like a mask for decades, the primordial darkness that fed on human suffering and had been banished but not destroyed. "Did you think it would be so easy, little guardian?" The thing's voice was a symphony of whispers, each one carrying the dying breath of someone it had devoured over the centuries. "Did you think purifying one spring would be enough to cage me forever?" The shadow form towered above them now, reaching toward the storm clouds that had been gathering since dawn. Jesse felt its alien hunger pressing against his consciousness like acid, searching for any crack in his defenses. Around him, the townspeople of Perdition Creek stumbled backward in terror, but there was nowhere to run. The darkness had learned from its defeat below. This time, it wouldn't be content with a single puppet. "I have fed on this land's pain for generations," the entity continued, tendrils of shadow reaching toward Sarah McKenna, toward old Pete Garrison, toward Jesse's own father. "Every moment of rage, every desire for vengeance, every choice to answer cruelty with cruelty, all of it feeds me. And you, child, have given me such a feast." Jesse felt the truth of those words like a physical blow. In asking the people to transform themselves, he had exposed their deepest wounds to this predator's influence. Sarah's justified fury at her husband's murder, his father's rage over Moonfeather's execution, the bitter resentment that decades of oppression had carved into every heart present, all of it was fuel for the ancient hunger. The shadows reached for Ben Hawthorne first, drawn by the raw grief and anger pouring off him in waves. Jesse watched in horror as dark tendrils began wrapping around his father's arms, and saw the exact moment when Ben's weathered face went slack with alien influence. Much better, the entity purred through Ben's stolen voice. A father's rage burns so much brighter than a cattle baron's greed. Shall we begin again, boy? Shall we see how your precious mercy fares against a parent's righteous fury? Ben's hand dropped to the Colt revolver at his hip, moving with inhuman speed and precision. The gun cleared leather and swung toward Jesse's heart in one fluid motion, but Jesse was already moving, silver fire erupting around him like a shield. The bullet struck the barrier of sacred light and dissolved into harmless sparks. "Pa, I know you're in there," Jesse called out, even as more shadows reached for other members of the crowd. "This isn't you. This is everything you taught me to fight against." But Ben's possessed form was already firing again, each shot forcing Jesse to pour more energy into his defenses. Around them, the entity's influence spread like wildfire through the assembled crowd. Sarah McKenna's eyes went black as midnight, and she began advancing on Jesse with her late husband's skinning knife gleaming in her hand. Old Pete Garrison snatched up a fallen rifle, while others grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Jesse realized with growing desperation that he was facing his deepest fear made manifest, not his own death, but being forced to harm the very people he had sworn to protect. The entity had learned from their previous confrontation, choosing a battlefield where Jesse's compassion would become his greatest weakness. "You cannot strike us down without destroying the innocence we inhabit," the darkness taunted through a dozen stolen voices. "And we cannot be expelled without their willing cooperation. But look how eagerly they embrace us, child. Look how readily they surrender to hate." Jesse felt Moonfeather's spirit surge with urgency beside him, offering strength and guidance, but even their combined power had limits. He could feel the sacred spring's energy beginning to ebb as more and more of the crowd fell under the entity's influence. Soon there would be nowhere left to retreat. The possessed townspeople closed in from all sides, moving with predatory coordination that spoke of the ancient intelligence directing them. His father's gun clicked empty, but Ben simply drew his skinning knife and continued advancing with murder burning in his borrowed eyes. Jesse stood alone in the center of the shrinking circle, silver fire flickering around him like a dying candle flame, and finally understood the true nature of the choice before him. This was his moment of ultimate confrontation, not with external evil, but with the terrible possibility that love and mercy might not be enough to save the people he cherished most. The silver fire around Jesse pulsed once more before beginning to dim, and in that fading light, he saw the truth that had been waiting for him all along. His grandfather's spirit whispered through the connection between worlds, "The greatest power requires the greatest sacrifice, little warrior. Not of others, but of yourself." Jesse looked at his father's possessed face, at Sarah's hate-twisted features, at the dozen other souls trapped within the entity's influence, and felt his heart break clean in two. He had thought victory meant defeating the darkness, but now he understood. Victory meant becoming the light that could guide them home, even if it cost him everything. "I know what you want," Jesse said to the entity, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "You feed on pain, on anger, on the worst parts of human nature. But there's something you've never tasted, isn't there? Something that would sustain you far better than all their small hurts combined." The possessed crowd hesitated, and Jesse felt the alien intelligence focusing entirely on him. "Speak, child." Jesse smiled, and starlight gathered around his hands like blessing made manifest, the grief of a guardian, the willing sacrifice of someone who loves without condition. "You want to feed on their darkness, but I'm offering you something infinitely more powerful, my light." "Jesse, no." Moonfeather's spirit surged against him, desperate to intervene. "There has to be another way." But Jesse was already opening himself completely, tearing down every defense that protected his soul from the entity's hunger. The sacred spring's pure energy flowed through him like a river of silver fire, and he offered all of it freely, not as an attack, but as the ultimate act of love. "Take it," he whispered. "Take everything I am, everything I was meant to become, but let them go. They never chose this darkness. They're just hurt and afraid and tired of being victims. I'm the one you really want. I'm the one standing between you and this land." The entity's excitement was a roar of ancient hunger as it abandoned the townspeople entirely, shadow tendrils rushing toward Jesse like black lightning. Ben Hawthorne collapsed to his knees as the possession released him, his eyes clearing just in time to see his son surrounded by writhing darkness. "Boy!" Ben's anguished cry echoed across the square as Jesse disappeared within a cocoon of living shadow. Inside that darkness, Jesse felt the entity's true form pressing against his consciousness. Not the primordial evil he had expected, but something far more tragic. It was hunger itself made manifest, emptiness so profound it had forgotten everything except the need to consume. It had been feeding on human pain for so long that it no longer remembered what it had been before corruption claimed it. "You were like me once," Jesse realized, his thoughts touching the core of the entity's being. "You were a guardian too, weren't you? Protecting something precious until the weight of it broke you." The shadow cocoon shuddered as memories that had been buried for millennia began to surface. Jesse saw flashes of a green land beside an endless sea, of a young woman with silver fire dancing around her fingers as she stood against an invasion of true demons. He felt her determination, her love for her people, and the terrible moment when she realized that victory would require her own destruction. She gave too much, Jesse understood. Poured her entire soul into stopping the demons, but forgot to hold anything back for herself. The emptiness that remained became you. "I remember." The entity's voice cracked like breaking stone. "I remember her face, my face, before the hunger." Jesse felt the ancient guardian's anguish flooding through him, centuries of endless consumption in a futile attempt to fill a void that could never be satisfied. She had saved her world by sacrificing herself, but without anchor or purpose, her spirit had become the very thing she had fought against. "Then let me show you another way," Jesse offered. "Let me show you what I learned from my grandfather, from Moonfeather, from everyone who ever loved without expecting anything in return." Instead of pouring his power outward in a final burst that would destroy them both, Jesse drew the entity's consciousness deeper into his own being. He shared every memory of unconditional love, his mother's gentle songs, his father's steady strength, Moonfeather's joyous gallops across starlit fields. Most importantly, he shared the truth that had taken him so long to understand, that sacrifice without love was just destruction, but love without sacrifice was just sentiment. The shadow cocoon began to crack as silver light seeped through from within. Jesse felt himself aging rapidly as the sacred spring's power flowed through him, 10 years becoming 15, 15 becoming 20, the promise of his full adulthood burning away like morning mist. But with each year he surrendered, the ancient guardian's hunger grew quieter, filled at last by something other than pain. When the shadows finally dissolved completely, Jesse stood in the dusty street looking like a young man of 25, his dark hair now completely silver, his eyes holding depths that spoke of wisdom earned through ultimate sacrifice. The entity was gone, not destroyed, but transformed back into what it had always been meant to be. His childhood was the price of everyone's freedom, and Jesse paid it gladly. The resolution. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Jesse stood motionless in the dusty street, silver fire still flickering faintly around his transformed form, while the people of Perdition Creek stared at him with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. The boy they had known was gone, replaced by a young man whose prematurely silver hair caught the desert sunlight like spun moonbeams. Ben Hawthorne was the first to break. He stumbled forward on unsteady legs, his weathered hands reaching toward his son before falling helplessly to his sides. "Jesse? Boy, what have you done?" Jesse turned those ancient eyes toward his father, and Ben saw depths there that no 25-year-old should possess. The weight of sacrifice willingly borne. The terrible wisdom that came from touching the heart of primordial darkness and choosing love anyway. When Jesse smiled, it was still his son's smile, but shadowed now by understanding that made Ben's chest tighten with grief. "I'm still me, Pa," Jesse said softly. Just older than I was supposed to be. Sarah McKenna pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears of shame and confusion. The things I was thinking, the hatred that filled me when that shadow took hold. She pressed her hands to her temples as if trying to scrub away the memory. How do you not hate us for what we almost became? Jesse knelt beside Moonfeather's peaceful form, and the stallion's spirit light pulsed brighter in response to his touch. Because I felt what she felt, the guardian who became that entity. She started just like us, wanting to protect what she loved. The corruption came later, when sacrifice became all she knew how to do. He looked up at Sarah with infinite compassion. Your anger was righteous, Mrs. McKenna. Your husband deserved justice. The darkness didn't create those feelings, it just twisted them into something they were never meant to be. Old Pete Garrison shuffled forward, his aged voice trembling. But what happens now? That thing, it's really gone? Healed, Jessie corrected gently. She remembered who she was before the hunger consumed her, found peace, finally. He rose from Moonfeather's side, and silver light rippled outward from his feet in gentle waves. The sacred spring's power flows free again. The land will remember how to be clean. As if to prove his words, the first drops of rain began to fall from the storm clouds that had been gathering since dawn. But these weren't the violent drops that had marked Crane's reign of terror. This was gentle precipitation that made the desert flowers bloom where it touched. The very air seemed to lighten, as if some oppressive weight had finally been lifted. Ben wiped the rain from his face, or perhaps it was tears. The price, though. Your childhood. Jesse's smile held no regret, though Ben could see the echo of lost innocence in his son's transformed features. Childhood ends anyway, Pa. At least this way, it meant something. At least it bought freedom for everyone else. Dr. Millicent Hayes, the traveling physician who had been tending to Crane's victims, stepped forward with professional concern overriding her amazement. Jesse, the aging process, how do you feel? Any pain, disorientation, memory gaps? I remember everything, Jessie assured her. Every year that passed through me, every moment of growing up I won't get to experience the normal way. But I also remember things that aren't mine. Knowledge the sacred spring shared, wisdom my grandfather tried to teach me, truths about how light and shadow can coexist without destroying each other. He gestured toward the crowd of townspeople, all of them freed now from the entity's influence, but still bearing the psychological scars of their brief possession. We all have darkness in us, the capacity for hatred, for revenge, for letting pain turn us into something we never meant to be. The trick isn't pretending that darkness doesn't exist. It's choosing love anyway, especially when love is hardest. Moonfeather's spirit suddenly blazed brighter, and Jesse felt his beloved horse's consciousness touching his own with fierce joy and pride. The stallion had never looked more alive, more real, even in death. His mane flowed like captured starlight, his eyes held depths that spoke of eternal freedom, and when he moved, silver hoofprints bloomed into desert flowers. He's not really gone either, is he? Ben whispered, wonder replacing some of his grief. Jesse shook his head, reaching out to stroke Moonfeather's glowing neck. Death isn't the end, it's just a different way of being. The bonds between souls, the love that connects us, that survives everything. He looked around at all the faces watching him, these people he had sacrificed his childhood to save. Moonfeather taught me that, even when his body failed, his spirit stayed strong. That's what real strength is, not fighting against loss, but loving so completely that loss becomes just another form of connection. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from Perdition Creek streets and filling the air with the scent of new growth. The immediate crisis had passed, but Jesse could already sense the challenges that lay ahead, the work of rebuilding, of learning to live without the familiar weight of oppression, of becoming the community they had always had the potential to be. His childhood was gone, but their future was just beginning. As the rain continued to wash Perdition Creek clean, Jesse found himself walking through a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, unsure how to treat the boy who had become a man before their eyes. He was still Jesse, still their protector, But the easy familiarity of childhood had been sacrificed along with everything else. Ben Hawthorne struggled the most. He followed his son through the muddy streets, reaching out as if to tousle hair that now showed silver in the lamplight, only to pull his hand back when he remembered. The casual affection between father and son had been complicated by Jesse's transformation, not lost, but requiring new navigation. "You don't have to treat me like I'm made of glass, Pa," Jesse said without turning around. His voice carried the same warmth it always had, but tempered now with an understanding that made Ben's chest ache. "I'm still your boy. Just a different version than we planned." They paused outside what had been Crane's mansion, now standing empty with its windows dark. Jesse placed his hand against the wrought iron gates, and silver light rippled along the metal before fading. "The corruption's completely gone from here. The land remembers what it was before fear poisoned it." "What will you do now?" Ben asked quietly. "The responsibility you've taken on, it's not going to just disappear because the immediate threat is over." Jesse smiled, and Ben caught a glimpse of the 10-year-old he'd been, mischief dancing in eyes that had seen too much. "Same thing I've always done. Take care of what matters. Only now I can do it better." Sarah McKenna approached them hesitantly, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought, well, you've been caring for everyone else. Seemed right that someone should care for you." She offered the cup to Jesse, then hesitated. "Though I suppose you don't much like being fussed over." Jesse accepted the coffee gratefully, his aged hands wrapping around the warmth. "Being grown up doesn't mean I don't need looking after, Mrs. McKenna. Just means I need it differently." He took a sip and closed his eyes in appreciation. "This is perfect, thank you." The simple exchange seemed to ease something in the gathered crowd. They had been treating Jesse like some untouchable guardian, but seeing him enjoy a cup of coffee reminded them that sacrifice didn't have to mean isolation. Their boy had changed, but he was still one of them. Old Pete Garrison shuffled forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Jesse, I want you to know what you saw in me when that shadow took hold. The anger, the desire for revenge, was human," Jesse interrupted gently. "Pete, you lost your grandson to Crane's violence. That pain doesn't just disappear because justice was served. The entity fed on real emotions, real wounds. Healing those is going to take time." "But how do we move forward?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the other townspeople who were beginning to emerge from their homes now that the supernatural threat had passed. "How do we rebuild trust after what we almost became?" Jesse looked around at the faces surrounding him. People he'd known his entire life, who had watched him grow from infant to child to this strange new in-between state, the same way families heal after they've hurt each other. One choice at a time, one act of grace at a time. We choose to remember the love instead of feeding the fear. Moonfeather's spirit materialized beside him, visible now to everyone as the barriers between worlds grew thin in the sacred spring's presence. Several townspeople gasped in wonder, but Jesse simply rested his hand on the stallion's luminous neck. "Moonfeather forgave his executioners before he died," Jesse said, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. "Not because what they did was right, but because forgiveness was his nature. That's what we're all called to in the end. Not to forget justice, but to remember that mercy makes us more than our worst moments." Ben stepped closer to his son, finally reaching out to touch that silver-streaked hair. "You sound like your grandfather when you talk like that. Like you're channeling wisdom from somewhere beyond yourself." "Maybe I am," Jesse admitted. "The sacred spring showed me things. Connections between past and present, the way love echoes across generations. Grandfather's still with us, Pa. Mom is too. All the people we've lost, they're not really gone, they're just transformed. Like energy becoming light or water becoming rain." The sun was setting now, painting Perdition Creek in shades of gold and amber. Jesse felt the weight of tomorrow settling on his shoulders, the practical work of helping a community heal, of learning to live with power he'd never asked for, of figuring out what it meant to be a guardian in peacetime. But tonight, surrounded by people who loved him despite everything he'd had to become, Jesse Hawthorne was exactly where he belonged. His childhood had ended in sacrifice, but his real life, the one that would define who he truly was just beginning. The new beginning. 6 months had passed since the darkness lifted from Perdition Creek, and the town bore little resemblance to the fearful place it had once been. Where Crane's mansion had stood, Jesse had helped the townspeople plant a community garden. Children played between rows of corn and beans, while their parents tended vegetables that grew with unusual vigor in soil blessed by the sacred spring's influence. Jesse stood at the edge of the garden, watching 8-year-old Tommy McKenna chase butterflies between the tomato plants. The boy's laughter carried on the warm morning air, a sound that would have been impossible during Crane's reign of terror. Sarah McKenna worked nearby, her hands deep in rich earth, her face peaceful in ways that spoke of genuine healing rather than merely forgotten pain. "Hard to believe how different everything looks," Ben said, joining his son beneath the shade of a cottonwood that had sprouted seemingly overnight where Moonfeather's blood had touched the ground. The tree's leaves shimmered silver in the breeze, and sometimes, just sometimes, those who looked closely could see the outline of a great horse running through its branches. Jesse nodded, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. The physical signs of his premature aging remained, but time had softened them somehow. He looked like a young man who had lived thoughtfully, rather than a child forced into adulthood through trauma. "Better than different," he said, "alive." The changes went deeper than community gardens and children's laughter. Dr. Hayes had established a permanent practice in town, drawn by reports of miraculous healings in the water that flowed from the spring Jesse had purified. Old Pete Garrison had started a school where children learned not just letters and numbers, but stories of their ancestors and the responsibility that came with living on sacred land. Even the weather seemed gentler, as if the very sky had exhaled a breath it had been holding too long. "Sometimes I catch myself looking for that angry 10-year-old, Ben admitted quietly. The boy who was so determined to save everyone that he forgot to save himself. Jesse smiled, and his father was struck again by how much wisdom lived in that expression, not the bitter knowledge of someone who had seen too much too soon, but the peaceful understanding of someone who had chosen love even when it cost everything. He did save himself, Pa. Just not the way either of us expected. A commotion near the schoolhouse drew their attention. Jesse's enhanced senses picked up the approach of strangers, a family by their scent and the protective way they moved, together, desperate by the tang of fear that clung to them. He was walking toward them before Ben even realized what was happening. The family consisted of a man and woman with a girl of perhaps 12, whose eyes held the particular emptiness Jesse had learned to recognize. Some form of spiritual corruption, though not as severe as what had plagued Perdition Creek. The parents saw Jesse approaching, and something in his bearing, the quiet authority, the silver light that seemed to follow in his footsteps, made them step forward with sudden hope. "Are you the guardian?" the father asked. "The one they say can heal what can't be healed?" Jesse paused, feeling the familiar weight of other people's expectations settling on his shoulders. 6 months ago, he might have bristled at the title, might have insisted he was just a boy trying to help. Now he simply nodded. "I'm Jesse. What's wrong with your daughter?" As the family explained about shadow sickness, about a cursed mine in their distant town where something hungry waited in the darkness, Jesse listened with the patience his grandfather had taught him. This was his life now. Not the normal childhood he had sacrificed, but something more complex and infinitely more meaningful. When they finished speaking, he knelt to the girl's eye level, ignoring her parents' protective hovering. "What's your name?" "Lucy," she whispered, and Jesse heard the echo of ancient whispers trying to drown out her voice. "Well, Lucy, I think we can help each other. But first, are you hungry? My friend Mrs. McKenna makes the best cornbread this side of the territorial capital." The girl's smile was tentative but real, and Jesse felt the shadows clinging to her spirit retreat slightly in the face of simple human kindness. That was the lesson he tried to carry forward from everything he had learned, that healing began not with power or sacrifice, but with the fundamental recognition that every soul deserved to be seen and valued. As he led the family toward town, Ben fell into step beside them. Father and son moved together with the easy rhythm of partners who understood each other completely, and Jesse felt a deep contentment settle in his chest. His childhood was gone, but his family remained. His innocence had been sacrificed, but his capacity for love had only grown stronger. Behind them, the cottonwood's leaves rustled in a wind that sounded almost like hoofbeats, and Jesse smiled without looking back. Some bonds transcended everything, even time, even death, even the choice to become more than you were meant to be. His real life was just beginning.